We can begin, and we do want to welcome you to the first class about the end times. We're going to talk today about the fat lady is singing. We're going to begin in Matthew chapter 24, which is called the Olivet Discourse of Jesus. The Olivet Discourse is when the disciples begin to ask Jesus questions about these end times. How are we going to know when that time is drawing near? And Jesus gives his response. So that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. Now, as we begin today, there are handouts for everybody, so we're going to begin looking at those. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to begin looking at the title. Now, when you think about the title, The Fat Lady is Singing, that's where it actually comes from. Is any of you who have ever been to an opera? If you've ever been to an opera, and Marquel, you're just caught live on TV, so there you go. So anyway, if you've ever been to an opera, you know that the last act of many operas, it ends with a kind of large lady with one of those powerful voices, and that's how the thing kind of ends. That's the last act. When the fat lady's singing, you know the opera's about to be over. All the guys in here, you've heard that in sporting events, because just about every sports announcer reaches a point to where he says, well, it looks like the fat lady is singing. What that means is it's the bottom of the ninth, there are 2 outs, there's 2 strikes on the batter and behind by 9 runs. Well, yeah, it's pretty much over. It's like in basketball where there's just a minute or so left and the team's behind by 35 points. Well, you know, it is pretty much over. So when you hear that reference, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to when something is coming to a conclusion. When something, you can see the signs, it's pretty much over. That's what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks is end time signs. What do we look out for? What is coming? Now, we know there's going to be all kind of differences of opinions because people have all kind of opinions, because we're going to begin by just looking on the outline that you got of all these numbers and people. All these numbers and people are significant when it comes to the end times, because all these numbers that you see, these were numbers that people used to predict, and they said, this is my prediction, this is when it's all going to end. We're going to look at that. Then on the right side, you're going to see all these people who have come up with these kind of answers as they got an idea, they know when the end will be here. So let's begin by looking at these numbers as kind of an introduction. Because the first thing you see is the number 1666. Now, why in the world would people who were alive in the year 1100, in that year right there, how many people who are living in that year right there, 1666, you know, you can come on in. That's about the time, you know, when all the pilgrims start coming over or whatever. But you know, it's a long time ago. But the reason they start with that number 1666 is not because of the thousands, but it's because of the what? The 666. I mean, there are people everywhere, and they begin to say, here's how you know the world is going to end. It's because it is the year of our Lord, 1666, 666. They were saying what's going to happen is what? What's going to happen is apparently the Antichrist is going to appear, and he's going to show up, and the year 666, so there you go. But then there's another number. The number is 1985. How many of you were alive in 1985? Okay, well, do you remember there was a guy who wrote a book, 85 Reasons the World Will End in 1985. I don't even remember who the author was, but you can look it up. You can buy one on Amazon. I don't know why you'd want to read it, because 1985's already passed. It didn't happen, so it's a bunch of malarkey. But anyway, he made that prediction. But then here's another year, January 1st, 2000. We know that year is what? It is called Y2K. Many people thinking what's going to happen in the year 2000 is all the computers are going to mess up and planes are going to be crashing and people are going, I mean, you're not going to be able to watch TV. I mean, disasters everywhere. That must be the end. It's got to be on January 1st, 2000. In fact, how many of you were anxious around December 31st of the year 1999? Because people were thinking, what's going to happen? Is my computer going to blow up? Is my electricity going to stop? Am I not going to be able to get any water to drink? Is my car, because of all the electronic gadgetry in it, is it not going to turn over when I go out there the next day? We were living in hysteria, just waiting to see what's going to happen. Then there's another year, December 12th, 2012. Anybody remember that? What was going on then? Well, in that day, there was something called the Mayan calendar that had gotten very prominent. I mean, all these people, they were studying the Mayan calendar, and according to the calculations of the Mayan calendar, the Mayan Indians believed the world, that was it, according to their calendar, that's everything it's going to close down. Okay. So there's the numbers. But then over to the right, you see the names. Now, here are some names that you probably have heard of. For example, you start with the first name, Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey wrote a book back when I was a teenager called The Late Great Planet Earth. How many of you read that book? Man, that was prominent, that was popular, and in fact, they made a movie about it, and you remember watching the movie, and it would scare you to death, because you'd see, and what it was talking about is when the rapture would come, and you'd see all these cars just running out of control because there's nobody driving them, and all these planes crashing to the ground because there's nobody flying them, and just people that, just in sports stadiums, and all of a sudden half the crowd's gone. Well, anyway, we know that didn't take place. Then also, do you remember Jack Van Impe? If you watch Christian TV any in the 1980s and 90s, Jack Van Impe was the big prophecy guy. And he'd come on every Saturday night, and he would tell you, here are the things that happened this past week that show you the end is near. And he would turn to his wife, Roxanne, every week, and he'd turn to her, Roxanne, that's just a sign, it is near. But anyway, it didn't happen. Then also, Tim LaHaye. Remember Tim LaHaye? How many of you read the books Left Behind? The Left Behind series, all about the end. Now, there's some good stuff in there because that is actually a projection of what could happen, and maybe many of those things can happen. It's written from an amillennial post-tribulation view, which that's a big theological word. Baptists think that the rapture occurs before the tribulation. He particularly believes that the rapture does not occur before the tribulation. That's why you read the book that way. But anyway, so there's some Left Behind. But then also, how many of you have ever known a Seventh-day Adventist? You know a Seventh-day Adventist? Go to church on Saturday. That's pretty much, that's about all I know. I know they go to church on Saturday. And, well, that's okay. I just don't know how you can go to church while college football's on. I don't, why when Jesus would never put the day to worship in conflict with college football. I don't believe that would ever happen. Now, that was a joke. Some people don't know when I'm joking. That was a joke. But anyway, but the Seventh-day Adventists, way back in 1822, there was a guy by the name of William Miller. There was a sect of people known as the Millerites. Now, the Millerites were following him because he had to make some predictions. In fact, he predicted that in 1822, on a particular date, the world was going to end. When it did not end, it was followed up by something called the Great Disappointment. Because all the people who followed him, they were just waiting on it to happen, and now it didn't happen. So now, you know what they've done? They've sold everything they've had. They've quit their jobs. They've just given up everything because they're expecting that date right there. It's almost like when you go and buy lottery tickets, which I know none of you buy lottery tickets, but, yes, you do. But anyway, when you go buy that lottery ticket, and there's some of you, and you go home and you watch the guy, the guy on the television, and he's got the Powerball thing going on, and you see them numbers going down there, and you have to hurry and get home before he comes on at 7 o'clock or whatever time the dude comes on. You got to get there because you got to know when that thing comes. I think I'm going to win today. And then you don't win. Just like you have not won the other 5,000 days you've gone home to look at that. Look at that. You're not going to win. But you go home anyway with that expectation. This is the day. Well, they had reached the point where they just believed that was going to be the day. When the day didn't happen, the great disappointment, and out of that, he said, well, we got to back up on this thing and start something new. So what began at that point was something called the Seventh-day Adventist. Okay, so there you go. So that's the introduction. Now, you ready to get started? All right, well, let's begin. Matthew chapter 24. If you have your Bibles, that's where we're going to be looking. But if you have your outline, you're going to get the kind of the verses that you're going to be able to see. So here Jesus is. He's starting what is called his Mount Olivet Discourse. And as he begins to talk about it, if you find it in verse 3, the Bible says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of the coming, your coming, and the end of the age? That is Matthew 24:3. They're asking Jesus these questions. How are we going to know when you are coming back? How are we going to know when all this is going to wrap up? Will you tell us ahead of time so that we can have this special information, this special knowledge? How are we supposed to know? And then what Jesus begins to do, beginning in verse 5, is he begins to talk about all the different things that are going to take place, and these are going to be the signs, these are going to be things to look out for. It doesn't mean that he's coming yet. It's like a birth pain thing, but you know that the time is near. The fat lady is singing. It's beginning its countdown. How many of you watch countdowns? A lot of churches have countdowns. You see it up on the screen. It'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And and what it is a polite way of saying, will you out there shut up and sit down? That's what that countdown does, okay? But we don't have one here. Y'all can talk whenever you want to. But anyway, so here the countdown begins. So here it is. Now let's begin by looking at Roman numeral 1. Now here's what's going to happen through this thing. I am not a very bright man. You know what I mean? This is going to be very elementary. It's going to be very basic. But we're going to learn some things that may help you just in a basic way. So let's begin. Roman numeral 1. You got it there on your outline? Roman numeral 1, where it says something about spiritual deception. Okay, now, when it talks about spiritual deception, Jesus is going to talk about things that you can see going on around you, and it should cause you to question some things because it's kind of weird, it's kind of strange, okay? That there's going to be some deceiving going on. There's going to be some, it's almost like some trickery going on. There's going to be some stuff that starts happening, and you need to call into question some of that stuff as to how real it really is. Now, here it is. Now, if you look in verse 5, it says this, "For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah." Then you look in verse 11, it says, "And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." It's kind of like you put verse 5 and verse 11 together. And he's going to talk about people, and going to talk about people and how they deceive us. And when you start seeing that happening, that's kind of a sign of the times. The end is drawing near. Now, let's think about individuals in recent times, because when he talks about there in verse 5 and refers that there are going to be those coming saying, "I am the Messiah." Have you ever known anybody who said they were a Messiah? I can tell you a story that's not fit for video, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So anyway, that's not what Jesus is talking about. Because that's one of the popular things. Some people have this mental illness thing, and they believe they're actually, incarnations of somebody. Many think they're actually Jesus. Okay. All right, so let's move on. But in recent times, there have been those who have made those claims and who have acquired quite a following. In Russia, for example, right now, there's a guy who refers to himself as Vissarion. He used to be a traffic cop in Russia, but now he all of a sudden thinks, well, you know what, I'm actually the reincarnation of Jesus. So now he has people in Russia who follow him around. There's a guy by the name of David Shaylor. He used to be an M15 officer in the British Intelligence Agency, but then after a while he just said, well, you know what, I think I'm Jesus. Then there's an Australian by the name of Alan John Miller who leads a group called the Divine Truth Movement. He says he's Jesus. Now let's get back to American history a little bit. How many of you remember something called Jonestown? Remember that? By the time Jim Jones got to Jonestown, Jim Jones thought he was Jesus. How many of you remember Waco, Texas? There was a guy by the name of David Koresh who thought, you know what I am? Y'all need to follow after me, and this is going to happen, and and he got into all this stuff. It was saying, I am Jesus. So Jesus makes it kind of a point that when you start seeing people have these movements, and they've got these cults, and they've got these sects, and they're led by a person, and that person claims to be Jesus, then that's a sign. Hey, this that something's not right. So that's number one. So there is spiritual deception seen in that way. But also, he says in verse 11 that spiritual deception is seen in false prophets. Now, what those false prophets are doing, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. All right, now what could he be referring to when he talks about a false prophet? A false prophet is somebody who has taken the Scriptures and they've got something entirely wrong and kind of off the charts and that's what their movement's kind of based on, you know. Now, a false prophet, for example, years ago would probably be somebody who advocated and preached snake handling. Okay? You ever know anybody handle snakes? When I was at the church I was at in Virginia, it was in Southwest Virginia, really close to West Virginia. I was really more in West Virginia than in, kind of from cultural standpoint. But anyway, there is actually where snake handling began. Snake handling began in the United States back in the 1800s. It actually began, I was up at a church called Nash's Chapel Baptist Church, which is on the top of Coburn Mountain. When you went down to the bottom of Coburn Mountain, there was a little white building there that had no windows in it. And it was a church. And guess what happened in that church? That's where it all started, right there. In fact, when I was there pastoring, there were people there that still practiced that. It was not, at that point, it was illegal in Virginia, but it was not illegal in West Virginia to handle snakes. So there was still some snake handling going on. It's illegal everywhere now, but it was still happening. Now, I had a friend of mine who was a professor at part of the University of Virginia who actually wrote a book about that, about snake. He came and went through all there and investigated all that. But anyway, that's for another time. But anyway, what they've done is they've taken something biblical and they've just totally shredded it. You've misinterpreted that thing, but they've based a movement on it. Okay. Now today, it would more than anything else be seen in something called this is the false prophet of today. It would probably be seen in something called the prosperity gospel. You ever heard of the prosperity gospel? Prosperity gospel is where these preachers tell you that you can be perfectly healthy and you can be financially wealthy if you will just operate in enough faith. And enough faith means you get enough faith to where you might sow a seed with my ministry. And as you sow a seed with my ministry, that's the ticket to where you're going to receive better health and you're going to receive financial wealth. You ever watch any of them guys on TV? They're all over the place. Okay? Now that is a false prophecy because, just because we're Christians, we don't get a get-out-of-jail card. You know what I mean? Any of you have ever been in jail? Some of you probably been in jail. That's okay. I don't care. But you think, well, why am I in jail? I'm a Christian. No, you don't get out. You go just like everybody else. You don't avoid sickness. Nope, you get sick like everybody else. You have hardship. You got problems. Your kids act like knuckleheads just like everybody else's kids. That's just the way it is. But anybody that tells you anything any different, they're shooting you a line. It's a lie. It's a false prophecy. Okay? Now, so, are we together right now? Because we got to speed up. I don't have a watch. 10:22. Boy, we got to move on. Now let's look at the next thing. First sign is spiritual deception. The second sign is social devastation. Now we're going to go real quickly through these things. It's found in verses 6 through 13 where Jesus, he said, now, you're going to know the end is coming when there is spiritual deception, when there's false prophets out there claiming to be Jesus, and then there's going to be false prophecies. There's going to be all kinds of people deceiving people in His name. But now there's social devastation. Now, let's do this right quick. The first thing you're going to see, He's telling us, is there's going to be disruptions. You find that in verses 6 and 7. Do you see all them D words? I made it easy for you to remember. To where when you're at the water fountain tomorrow with your coworkers, you can just start whopping off these D's right here, So anyway, there's disruption. Verses 6 and 7, here's what it says. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and let's just stop right there. Now, so he says there's going to be an increase in warfare, in hostilities, in fighting between nations. Now, Can you name some places where that's going on right now? Israel to Gaza to Lebanon and Iran. I mean, that thing's always a powder keg. That's just there. But then also there is, where else? Russia and Ukraine. Okay? And then also there is potentially, you got China, Thailand, something's probably going to happen there in the next couple of years. You got North Korea, something's probably going to, see, but the thing with all these different things, and every one of those people I've talked to you about, referred to, other than Ukraine, the interesting things about those people is they have what is called somebody give it a big old guess. They have a particular kind of weapon. They all have a nuclear weapon. Okay? Now, so you just put all that together, even North Korea, nuclear weapon. So what that means is they can cause what kind of devastation quickly? Okay? Now that's only happened since the 1950s. That's really been readily available, 50s and 60s, where you could just do that. So there he says, when you start seeing this increase between nations, and you always got people fighting, but he's talking about a time when these fights can just do what? They can just end it all, man. They can just obliterate everything. It's not just a little skirmish. You got little fights in your neighborhoods. Did you ever have fights in your neighborhood where you grew up? You had this side of the street against that side of the street, or however you did it. I had a family that lived up above me. It's I guess it was the first kind of blended family I'd ever known of. And I remember that his name was Marcus Raines, and her name was Fanny. Marcus got famous on the mill hill in the neighborhood because when he died, his coffin was put in the living room. Remember them days? When they brought the coffin out to the house? Yeah. So his coffin was brought out and put in the living room, being one of them mill village houses where you could actually see through the floor and see the ground down under there. Apparently had been some rotting going on, and during the night, Marcus went through the floor. Kind of wild. Anyway, that's just an aside. But here's the point I'm trying to make. That they were the first blended family, and there are times when his wife Fanny would get on the back porch and she would scream out at Marcus, who would be out, probably passed out, intoxicated somewhere, but she would scream out at Marcus, your kids and my kids is fighting our kids. Okay? Now think about that for a minute. That's pretty interesting right there. Your kids and my kids, they done ganging up on our kids. That's a dysfunctional family if there's ever been one, But anyway, but that's just a little skirmish. It's contained right there where? It's contained right there on Lucky Street in Easley, South Carolina. That's the only place it's going to happen, right there. But now Jesus is talking about this hostility between nations, and it's capable of affecting who? Everybody. All right, let's go to the next thing. We got to speed up. Now, there's also, when it talks about disruptions, in verse 9, look at this, because he talks about something else very important. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. Now, if you really get into that, what he's really referring to is he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to people of Jewish heritage. Okay? Jesus is referring to a rise in anti-Semitism. Now, you've heard that before, right? Okay. So Jesus is saying, hey, when you see all this starting to take place, man, they wars, and it's not only wars, it's wars that can affect everybody. And then he's saying also, you're going to see a rise. Because of me, you will be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated, And he's talking to those Jewish people, those disciples. Now, do you believe there's a rise in anti-Semitism? Yes. In the United States since 2023, let's see, that was what? Last year. Since 2023, there has been reported a 140% increase in anti-Semitism. Not 50%, not 140% increase in hatred toward the Jewish minority, the people. Now, you see this primarily where? You see it a lot today on what kind of college campuses? It's all over college campuses. And it's kind of mind-boggling to me when you see all these people protesting on college campuses, and they're protesting against Israel because they're saying, well, we want the people of Gaza to be in power. Well, they don't understand that means the Muslims will be in power, and that means the particular Muslims they are, that these woke people who are protesting are wanting to put into power people who are anti-woman, anti-LGBTQ, anti-just about everything else. They want to put, I mean, can you imagine that? The people who are protesting are the ones, they must not have any idea who they're wanting to put into power, because the people they're wanting to put into power are against everything they're for. Anyway, just a thought. So are you with me? Let's go to the next thing. There's disruptions, and then secondly, there is desperation. Because there in verse 7 again, look at what it said. Nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be what? There will be famines. So desperation is coming. Now, when you think of desperation in that word famine, what that means is there's going to be a lot of people that's going to be real hungry, okay? Food insecurity. Now, how many of you, because when you talk about these nations rise against nation, I just thought about this, how this could be related, and hostilities begin. I mean, have you ever been hangry? Yes. Hangry means that you are hungry, and because you're so hungry, you're starting to get angry, so you get hangry. You know, that's what I was trying to tell Melanie about when and Linda would get hungry, and she gets hangry on me, and she just starts, man, she just, and after, well, I understand, honey, you're just hungry. You know, go get you a piece of meat over there, and you'll be all right. You know, she gets hangry. But it's talking about a hunger, a famine. Now listen to this. Now here's some stats I'm going to give you to where we are right now. That a person in the world, on the planet, a person dies from starvation or one of its diseases, because malnutrition causes all kinds of diseases. A person dies from starvation or one of its diseases every second of every day. There are 31 million people who die every year because of food problems, because of malnutrition, because of hunger. 75% of the 31 million are infants under the age of, give it a guess, 5. I mean, you look around the world, maybe not here, but it happens here. I mean, there are people around. Food insecurity is in a lot of places. But you think some of the places around Yemen, the Sudan, where people are literally starving to death. Jesus says when you start seeing that take place, and man, when you start having somebody die every second, that's pretty much, that's here. So there's not only disruptions, there's desperation. And then he says there will be disease. Verse 7 again. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. You find all well, there's the word disease somewhere, but anyway, y'all just look around there. When you find the word pestilence, you find it? Okay, so the word pestilence is referring to what? Pestilence is referring to disease. Now, when you think about disease, if you go to Revelation chapter 6 and verse 8, it's talking about the future, and it's talking about a time when 25% of the world's population, as it gets closer to the end, 25% of the world's population will die because of disease. Okay? Now, Revelation 6:8, mark that down. Now, during COVID, how many of you had COVID? Okay? COVID killed a lot of people. Okay? But listen to this. COVID actually killed, because you watched the news every night, didn't you? And you watch the hospitals and the doctors overworked, what we're going to do, people are dying everywhere, you got to have these makeshift morgues and have bodies frozen somewhere. I mean, it's just awful. But listen to this. The percentage of people who died from COVID is at 0.1%. Okay? That's not a lot. Now, what he's saying is when that takes place, that 25% of the people, 1 out of every 4, when that pestilence hits, 1 out of every 4 will die. Now, could that happen? Is that possible? You know, when you think of everything that's out there, and probably the biggest threat to that is something called, that hadn't been even on people's lips until the last 25 years, is something called bioterrorism, okay? By which some foreign substance or whatever can be released into the atmosphere or put in the drinking water or whatever, and it just takes out numerous people, okay? So Jesus is saying that when you see these things start to take place, when you see the capability of these things starting to take place, that the potential for these things to happen starting to take place, that's a sign. Disruption, desperation, disease, and then there is disasters. Verse 7 again, he talks about there'll be famines and there'll be earthquakes in various places. And I was reading something the other day. There was some town in like Tennessee that had experienced like 20 tremors of earthquakes just in the last week or so. What in the world's going on? How can you have earthquakes in Tennessee? You know? Huh? 10:35. Okay. Well, do you want me to go quickly or you want to start there next week? Let's just start there next week. So we're at the time marked by disasters, and we'll move on. We'll move on from there. Next week, I will talk faster. But we got to let people start coming in here for church. But thank you for coming. I'll put a mark right here. I hope you learned something. Next week, we're going to finish that up, but then next week we're going to deal with Revelation entirely. And we're going to talk about the vials and the trumpets and the horses, all the symbolism and signs in Revelation. That's what we're going to talk about next week. All right? That'll take a couple of weeks to do that. Okie dokie.